The Duke found a woman wearing his dead wife's ring until he learned who she was. The fire had burned down to embers when Henry Ashton, Duke of Ashton, finally set aside his pencil. The drawing on the table before him was the same one he had been revising for 3 years. A greenhouse. 80 feet of glass and iron. Designed to sit at the eastern edge of the estate where the morning light came in at an angle his wife had called precisely right. He had drawn it first as a wedding gift, rolled the plans and tied them with ribbon, watched her face when she unrolled them across the breakfast table. She had said, "When do we begin?" He had said, "Whenever you're ready." She had never been ready. Then she had never been anything at all. Henry rubbed his eyes and reached for the small framed sketch he kept on the corner of the drafting table, a quick study his wife had made of the greenhouse's proposed interior. Plants he could not name crowding the margins in her loose, confident hand. He had been meaning to move it somewhere safer for 2 years. He never did that. He set it back in its place. The candles had guttered low. Outside, the January wind came off the moors in long, deliberate sweeps, finding every gap in the old stone walls. Henry was accustomed to this room at this hour, the cold, the quiet, the particular quality of silence that settled over Ashton Park when the last servant had gone to bed and there was nothing left in the world except the unfinished drawing and the dwindling fire. He was reaching to snuff the nearest candle when the sketch fell, not slowly. It dropped straight off the table's edge as if something had nudged it. The small wooden frame cracking against the flagstone floor. Henry bent to retrieve it. And stopped. There was a woman asleep in the chair by the fire. He did not move for a long moment. She was curled into the wingback chair with the particular stillness of someone in a deep and exhausted sleep. A traveling cloak pulled around her shoulders, her face turned toward the warmth of the dying coals. Dark hair had come loose from its pins and fallen across her cheek. Her boots were still on, muddy to the ankle. There was a small cut at her temple. Dried and dark. Henry's gaze moved from her face to her hands. Her right hand rested in her lap, fingers loosely curled. On her fourth finger was a ring he recognized with a precision that struck him somewhere below the sternum, a narrow gold band set with a single oval emerald. Slightly too large for the stone setting. The shoulder engraved with a pattern of interlocking knots so fine that most people never noticed it. He had commissioned that ring 11 years ago. He had placed it on his wife's hand on their wedding day. He had last seen it locked inside a mahogany box in his wife's dressing room, which he had not entered since her death, to which he held the only key. Henry set the framed sketch back on the table with a care that was entirely at odds with the cold that had moved into his chest. He crossed the room in silence. He crouched beside the chair and looked at the ring for a long moment. The familiar weight of the stone. The engraving he could have traced from memory, the slight irregularity in the band where the goldsmith had needed to correct an error in the first casting. Then he said, very quietly, "That ring was locked in a box." The woman woke, her eyes opened with the sudden animal alertness of someone who had not been sleeping peacefully but merely deeply awareness returning all at once, without the slow negotiation of a comfortable bed. They were gray, her eyes. Not blue-gray or green-gray but a clear, uncommon gray. And in the first second they registered him. They registered also the chair, the room, the fire, and the ring on her finger with a sequence of recognition that told him she had forgotten, momentarily, where she was. Then she looked at the ring, and he watched something close in her face, not guilt, precisely. Or not only guilt. It was the expression of someone who had been handed a task they did not know how to complete and had been found, mid-attempt, by the one person they could not explain themselves to. She sat up straighter. She did not try to remove the ring. "I apologize," she said. Her voice was low and slightly rough with sleep, but her diction was careful, educated. "I didn't intend to." Mrs. Aldrich said I might wait by the fire. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." Mrs. Aldrich, his housekeeper, who had apparently admitted a stranger into his private drafting room at some hour of the night without informing him. He filed this for later. "Where did you travel?" "From York." A pause. "The road was worse than I expected. A wheel came loose on the carriage about 4 miles out. I walked the rest." He looked at her boots. "For miles in January mud, across the moorland road. The cut at her temple that she had not mentioned, the ring. He said, she did not look at it. She looked at him. I know how it appears, tell me how it appears. As though I took something that wasn't mine. Her hands were clasped now in her lap. The ring hidden beneath her right fingers. Or as though someone gave me something that wasn't theirs to give. The second phrasing was specific enough to be deliberate. Henry straightened from his crouch and moved to the mantelpiece, placing a few feet of space between them. Giving himself room to think. That ring, he said, is kept in a mahogany box in the East Wing dressing room. The box has a brass lock. I hold the key. He looked at her steadily. I have held the only key since my wife died. 3 years ago, something moved across her face at the word wife. Not surprise. Acknowledgement, the only key. He repeated. How did you open the lock? She was quiet for a moment that was fractionally too long to be uncertainty. It was the pause of someone choosing their words with great care. That I didn't, she said finally. I didn't open anything. Then how? Someone else opened it. Her voice didn't waver. But her hands had tightened in her lap. Someone else gave me the ring and told me to wear it. I was told it was expected. He turned the word over carefully. He had agreed, 18 months ago, to receive a visit from the Carrington family, the family of his late wife's second cousin, who had corresponded with his solicitor about a matter relating to the estate's entailment. He had agreed because his solicitor had advised him to, and because he had, at the time, been incapable of caring about very much. The correspondence had referenced an unmarried daughter. There had been some vague implication of a possible arrangement. He had not attended carefully to the details that he attended to them now. You are, he said slowly, the young woman who was to arrive this week from the Carrington family. She looked at him steadily. Yes, and the ring was given to you by my uncle. Another careful pause. He said it had been set aside for this visit. He said it was part of the documentation. That I should wear it when I've documentation. Henry looked at the ring, at the engraving he had designed himself, at the stone that had taken him 3 weeks to select from the jeweler's inventory because the proportions of every other stone had been wrong. That ring, he said, was never part of any documentation. It was my wife's personal jewelry. It was not part of the estate inventory. It was not listed in any correspondence with your family's solicitor. He paused. It was locked in a box that I believed no one else could open. She met his gaze. She did not flinch. Ow, she said quietly, then you understand why I want to know how your uncle obtained a duplicate key to a lock that was made to order, in a room that has been sealed for 3 years, without my knowledge. The fire shifted, settling lower. In the changed light he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, not a girl, but not far past the beginning of her 20s. With the particular combination of composure and visible effort that suggested she had spent considerable time learning to look calmer than she felt. I can't answer that, she said. Not completely. Not yet, cannot or will not, both. She looked at him directly. And in her gray eyes he saw something that was not evasion but something more like precision. The look of someone who was choosing the exact boundaries of what they were able to honestly say. I can tell you that I didn't take it. I can tell you that wearing it was not my idea. I can tell you that I understood, when my uncle placed it on my finger before I left, that it was meant to establish something. To signal something to you. She stopped. I didn't ask enough questions about where it came from. That was a failure of judgment and not able to excuse. Henry was silent. This was not the response he had anticipated. He had anticipated denial. Or a performance of innocence, or a story carefully constructed to place the fault elsewhere. He had not anticipated this careful, deliberate accounting of exactly what she did and didn't know, offered without embellishment or evasion. With the specific gravity of someone who understood precisely what it would cost. That he looked at her for a long moment, then he crossed to the writing desk and opened the lower left drawer. Inside, on top of the estate ledgers, was a mahogany box approximately the size of a large book. He set it on the drafting table. From his waistcoat pocket he withdrew a small brass key that he unlocked the box. Inside, in the velvet-lined interior he had not looked at directly in 3 years. There was nothing. The indentation where the ring had rested was empty. Henry looked at the empty box for several seconds, then he looked at the woman sitting by his fire, wearing his dead wife's ring. Watching him with grey eyes that were frightened and steady in equal measure. "That I have some questions," he said, "that I would like you to answer honestly." She looked at the empty box. Then at him. "I'll answer what I can," she said. "That," he said quietly, "is not quite the same thing. No." She agreed. "It isn't that he did not send her away that night, that he told himself it was because the hour was past 2 in the morning and the roads were impassable in the dark, and because Mrs. Aldrich, who had apparently made a series of unilateral decisions this evening, had already prepared a room in the guest wing. It had nothing to do with the way the woman had said both when he asked her whether she could not or would not answer him. It had nothing to do with the specific quality of her composure, the sense that she was not performing calm but maintaining it at considerable cost, because she had decided it was necessary that he showed her to the guest wing himself, because waking Mrs. Aldrich again seemed unnecessarily punitive. At the door he paused. "The roads to York will be passable by mid-morning," he said. "If you wish to leave then, I won't prevent you." She looked at him steadily. "And if I don't wish to leave, then I have some questions I'd like answered before you do." He held her gaze. "I have my wife's journal. The last volume. From the year before she died. Tomorrow morning I intend to read you certain passages from it and ask you to explain what you know about them." He paused. "If your answers satisfy me, we can discuss the matter of the ring and the matter of your uncle's correspondence in a more considered manner." She was quiet for a moment. The candlelight in the corridor made her look tired in a way that the firelit drafting room hadn't cut at her temple more visible. The shadows under her eyes more pronounced. "And if my answers don't satisfy you, then I'll write to your uncle this afternoon and ask him to send a carriage." She considered this for several seconds with the focused expression of someone evaluating terms they hadn't been given a choice about. "All right," she said finally. "What is your name?" Another pause fractionally too long. The same measured hesitation had noticed earlier. "Isabel," she said. "Isabel Carrington." He studied her face for a moment. She held his gaze without difficulty. "Good night, Miss Carrington," he said. And left her there. He was in the dining room at 8 when she came down. She had changed into a traveling dress of dark blue wool, somewhat rumpled but clean. And she had managed to pin her hair properly despite what he suspected was a complete absence of luggage. The cut at her temple had been cleaned. She moved into the room with a self-possession that he found, against his better judgment, difficult to fault. He had placed his wife's journal on the table beside his coffee cup. She glanced at it when she sat down, then looked away. Mrs. Aldrich served breakfast with the careful efficiency of someone who knew she was in professional disgrace and was attempting to remedy it through exceptional service. When she had withdrawn, Henry opened the journal to the page he had marked the night before. "I am going to read you something," he said. "And then I'm going to ask you a question." She picked up her coffee cup. "Go on." He read. "The East Conservatory proportion is wrong. I've written to H about it twice but he doesn't see it yet. The error is in the southern load calculation. I've shown it to Isabel and she agrees. Though she was more precise about it than I was. She said the bearing point will shift in approximately 3 years and the iron will start to show stress fractures along the upper east seam. I don't know where she learned to read a structural drawing but she reads them better than I do." Henry close. The journal, across the table. Isabel Carrington had gone very still. My wife wrote that entry 14 months before she died, he said. She refers to a person named Isabel who was able to read a structural drawing and who identified a load calculation error in the East Conservatory plans. He paused. "That conservatory was never built. The plans have been in my drafting room for 4 years. No one outside this household has seen them." He looked at her. "No one except, apparently, the person my wife showed them to." She set down her coffee cup with a care that suggested her hands were not entirely steady. "You said your name was Isabel Carrington." He said. My wife's entry names someone called Isabel. I want to know whether that is a coincidence. She looked at the journal for a long moment. Then she looked at him. It isn't, she said. Then you knew my wife. That I met her 3 times. I think. Perhaps 4. Her voice was level, but he could hear the effort beneath it. She came to my father's house with her mother, twice, when I was younger. And once she came here. And I was with her. She wanted to show me the estate. Henry was quiet. He had not known his wife had brought anyone to Ashton Park before their marriage. He had not asked. It had not occurred to him that there were portions of her life he did not have a complete accounting of. She showed you the conservatory plans, he said. She showed me the drawings. Yes. She was very proud of them. She said you'd designed them together. A pause. I told her the load calculation in the southern section was off. She asked me to show her where. I marked it in pencil on the working copy. She met his gaze. I assumed you'd corrected it eventually. Henry thought about the working copy of the conservatory plans, which was currently in the second drawer of his drafting table, which still had a pencil mark along the southern load line that he had always assumed was his own notation and had never been able to locate in his own handwriting. That he said nothing for a moment. That I want to understand something. He said finally. Your uncle sent you here with my wife's ring and instructions to present yourself as a prospective match. You told me last night that you were Isabel Carrington. He paused. But you did not tell me that you had met my wife. That you had been to this estate. That your name appears in her journal. She looked at the tablecloth. Then back at him. No, she said. I didn't. Why not? The pause this time was longer. He watched her decide something. Because I wasn't certain what you would do with it. She said. Whether it would make things better or considerably worse. Henry picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. Outside the dining room windows, the January light was flat and white. The moors beyond the garden wall featureless under frost. That I told you last night, he said, that if your answers satisfied me we could discuss this in a more considered manner. He looked at her. I'm going to revise that. I'd like you to stay for 3 days. I have more questions. And I suspect the answers require more time than a single morning. He paused. I also want to examine the conservatory plans with you. The pencil mark in the southern section. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Surprise, and something more guarded beneath it. 3 days. She said that if you're willing. Another of her precise, measuring silences. And the ring, you can continue to wear it, he said, until I've decided what to do about it. He stood, picking up the journal. I'll have Mrs. Aldrich show you the library. There are architectural texts there. If you want to look at them while I finish some correspondence. He paused at the door. The conservatory plans are in the drafting room. I'll bring them to the library this afternoon. He left without waiting for her response. Which he recognized as a form of cowardice but found he couldn't remedy immediately. The conservatory site was on the eastern edge of the formal garden, accessible through a gate in the old stone wall that Henry had not unlatched in 18 months. It was not, precisely, a ruin. The foundation had been laid good Yorkshire stone, set properly, level within a margin he was still professionally satisfied with. The iron framework for the first 30 feet of the southern wall had been erected and then abandoned. The upright standing in the frozen garden like the beginning of a sentence that had stopped mid-word. Someone had covered the exposed stonework with canvas against the weather. He didn't remember giving that order, but someone had done it. He had brought her here because the library had felt. After an hour of sitting across a table watching her read his architectural texts with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for access to them, like insufficient space, she walked the perimeter of the foundation in silence. Her dark wool dress picking up frost from the dead grass. He watched her pause at the southern corner, crouch down to examine the join between the foundation stone and the first iron upright, straighten and look up at the standing framework. The uprights are good, she said. Better than good. Actually. The spacing is more precise than most residential work I've seen that I set them myself, he said. Before Head decided to say it, she glanced at him. You laid the iron. The first section. Before he stopped. Amended. Before construction was suspended, she looked at the framework for another moment, then turned to walk the southern wall line. He followed at a slight distance. Watching her read the structure the way he would have read a page of text, not decoratively but functionally, her attention moving from detail to detail with a logic he recognized, she stopped. Here. She said that he stopped beside her. She was standing at a point approximately 20 feet along the southern wall, looking at the second upright from the eastern corner. The angle is 3 degrees off vertical. She said. It's subtle enough that it wouldn't be visible to most people. But the load from the glass panels will distribute unevenly across the upper east seam, and in approximately, she paused. Tilted her head slightly. In approximately 3 years. You'll start to see stress fractures in the iron along here. She traced a line with one finger, not touching the metal, indicating the path along the upper section. Henry looked at the upright that he looked at his own design notes, which he carried in his coat pocket as habit. Which he had reviewed the previous night. In which the load distribution calculation for the southern wall contained a margin note in his own hand that said check east seam possible variance, and which he had written there 2 years ago and never resolved. That he looked at the upright for a long time. You said this before. He said. His voice came out more carefully than Head intended. My wife's journal says you told her the same thing. About the load point. The 3 years. The east seam, the geometry doesn't change. She said simply, you read the plans 4 years ago. You read them once. That I have a reasonably accurate memory for structural drawings. A pause. It's not a skill I can particularly explain. I simply. She seemed to look for a word. I see where the weight will go. Henry was quiet. That he was thinking Abu. The pencil mark on the working copy of the plans. About the 2 years he had spent looking at that mark and assuming it was his own. About the fact that the margin note in his current design notes check east seam possible variance had been prompted by something he had seen in the structure but had no been able to precisely articulate. She had articulated it 4 years ago. In pencil, on a working copy she had seen once. Come inside, he said. I want to show you the revised drawings. She looked at him with that gray, measuring expression. All right. She said. That he unlatched the gate and held it open. She passed through it without comment, and he followed. And neither of them said anything else until they reached the drafting room. The revised drawings were spread across the drafting table by the time the afternoon light began to fail. Henry had not intended to spend 3 hours in the drafting room. He had intended to show her the corrected the RN wall calculation, confirm that the pencil mark on the working copy corresponded to her observation, and return to the correspondence he had abandoned that morning. Instead he had found himself pulling out the secondary elevation drawings, then the foundation survey. Then the revised load tables he had completed 18 months ago and then set aside without explanation to himself. She read them the way he read them. That was the unsettling part, not with the polite appreciation of someone being shown something they were expected to admire, but with the specific, practical attention of someone extracting information. She turned the drawings to examine them from different angles. She asked questions that were not about the aesthetic intentions of the design but about the structural reasoning behind specific decisions, why he had chosen that spacing for the roof glazing bars, whether the heating system had planned for the northern beds was intended to run continuously or by interval, what his tolerance was for thermal expansion in the iron framework during the summer months. That he answered all of them. He could not have said, afterward. At what point the conversation had stopped being a test and become something else. This section, she said. Indicating the eastern corner of the roof plan. You've changed it since the working copy. That I simplified the glazing bar configuration. The original design was more elaborate. That I can see that. She studied the revision. The simplified version is structurally stronger, yes, but it loses something. He tilted her head at the drawing. The original configuration would have cast a particular pattern of light in the mornings. Geometric. Quite striking, I imagine. Henry looked at the original working copy, which he had not looked at directly in 2 years that my wife designed that section. He said. The glazing bar pattern. A silence that I see, she said quietly. She did not say anything else about it. He rolled the working copy closed. We should stop for this evening. Mrs. Aldrich will have dinner ready. She helped him weight the corners of the revised drawings without being asked. The automatic courtesy of someone accustomed to working with large paper in drafty rooms. He found himself noticing this, the way her hands moved over the drawings, efficient and respectful, as though she understood that the paper mattered. At the door she paused. The paperweight, she said. On the corner of the table. He looked at it. It was a small carved piece of Yorkshire limestone, rough on 3 sides and polished smooth on the 4th where it caught the light. Shapid had not consciously thought about this in some time. Like nothing recognizable. He had carved it himself in the weeks after the funeral, in the same way he drew the conservatory plans, not toward anything, only away from the alternative. What about it? He said. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. Nothing, she said. I only noticed it. She went out. Henry stood alone in the drafting room for a moment, looking at the paperweight, then he picked it up and put it in his coat pocket. And was not entirely sure why. He found the entry by accident. He had not been looking for it. He had taken the journal from the library shelf, the last volume. The one he had used for his questions that morning, with the intention of finding a specific passage he half remembered about the kitchen garden, which had nothing to do with Isabel Carrington or structural drawings or paperweights. He found the kitchen garden passage. He read it. He turned the page. The entry was dated the 4th of March, 3 years before his wife's death. It was written in her usual hand. Slightly compressed, as it always was when she was writing quickly. The ink varying in density in the way that meant she had stopped and restarted several times. Henry hasn't touched the conservatory drawings in 6 weeks. I don't say anything because I know he has the estate accounts and the Yorkshire project and a dozen other things that are more urgent. But I miss the drawings. I miss us sitting over them in the evenings and arguing about the glazing bars. I want him to build it. I want to see it built. I had a letter from Isabel today. She's been in Edinburgh with her father's family for the winter. I wrote to tell her about the revised Southern Load Calco. Ation, the corrected one, with the pencil mark. She wrote back to say she had noticed something else. She thinks the bearing point in the eastern corner isn't right either. She's sent a sketch. She's right. Of course. She's always right about things like that. I don't know how she learned to read structural drawings. I asked her once and she said nobody taught her. She simply sees where the weight wants to go. I told H he should meet her properly someday. He said he would. Henry sat very still. He said he would. He turned the page. April. Henry has started on the drawings again. He's been in the drafting room every evening this week. I haven't told him abo. Isabel's correction yet. I keep meaning to, and then something interrupts. I'll tell him next week that he turned the page. There was no next week. There was a gap of 3 months, and then the entries became shorter. And then they stopped. Henry put the journal down on the library table with a precision that had nothing to do with care and everything to do with the need to set it down before his hands did something less controlled. She had written that she would tell him. She had not told him. The bearing poi. NT error in the eastern corner, which he had found himself and marked in his own design notes 2 years ago with the notation check east seam. Possible variance had been identified first by a woman he had never been introduced to, sent in a letter his wife had received in the spring. Noted in the margin of a sketch he had never seen. In a correspondence he had not known existed. He thought about the pencil mark on the working copy. He had spent 4 years assuming it was his own. He thought about the eastern corner correction in his current design notes. He had spent 2 years assuming he had found it himself. He thought abo. This morning about the conservatory site, about the way she had stood at precisely that point along the southern wall and said here, about the line she had traced through the air above the iron upright, about the specific phrase she had used. I see where the weight will go. She simply sees where the weight wants to go. His wife had known this woman. Had corresponded with her about the conservatory. Had trusted her assessment of drawings that she had never seen properly, that she was reading from memory. From a single afternoon 4 years ago that I told H he should meet her properly someday, Henry sat in the library for a long time, then he stood, and picked up the journal, and went to find her. She was in the small sitting room at the end of the guest wing corridor, which Mrs. Aldrich apparently used for her own reading in the evenings and which she had apparently offered to Isabel Carrington as well. Because she was sitting in the smaller of the two chairs by the window with a book open in her lap and the particular stillness of someone who had been trying to read and not quite managing it, she looked up when he came in. He crossed the room without preamble and set the journal open on the table beside her chair, open to the March entry, to the paragraph that contained her name. She looked at the page. He watched her read it. It took longer than it should have for a passage of that length. He understood, watching her face, that she was reading it more than once. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She did not seem embarrassed by this, only tired. Though she had been braced against something for a long time and had momentarily stopped bracing, she never told me she'd written about it. She said, she never told me she'd corresponded with you at all. He kept his voice even. I found the pencil mark on the working copy 4 years ago. I assumed it was my own notation. He paused. I found the eastern corner variance 2 years ago. I assumed I had identified it myself. She said nothing. You identified both of them, he said. Years before I did. Through correspondence with my wife. About drawings you had seen once. He looked at her steadily. I would like to understand how your uncle came to have my wife's ring. I would like to understand what exactly you were told about this visit and what you were told to do when you arrived. And I would like to understand. He stopped. Amended. I would like to know who you actually are. Not what your uncle told you to present yourself as. Who you are. She was quiet for a moment. Those are 3 different questions. She said that. I am aware. She looked at the journal entry again. Her hand moved toward it. Stopped short of touching the page. May I? She said that. He nodded. She turned the journal slightly toward her, so she could read the entry more easily. He watched her read it a second time. Or perhaps a third. Her expression was very still, in the way of someone receiving something they had not expected to receive, a kind of careful, deliberate acceptance, as though they were making sure not to damage it by handling it wrongly. Her name was Eleanor. She said finally. My cousin. She was 3 years older than me. She died in October. She looked up. Your wife's family wrote to my uncle in November. They said there was a prior arrangement. That Eleanor had been expected to come to Ashton Park in January. She paused. My uncle came to me in December. He said Eleanor's place needed to be filled, and that I was the most suitable remaining candidate, and that the details would be managed. Her voice was entirely level. He gave me a list of things to memorize. Eleanor's preferences, her habits. Things she had said to various family members about this visit. He gave me the ring the morning I left and told me it had been set aside for this occasion. She looked at him directly. I didn't ask where it came from. I should have. The fire in the small grate ticked and settled. You're not Isabel C. Arrington. Henry said that it was not a question. She held his gaze. My name is Jane. Jane Todd. A breath. Eleanor was my first cousin. Her mother and my father were siblings. She paused. I've known since November that I was being sent here in her place. I didn't know what to do about it. I still don't. Henry Lou. Cadet Herat Jane Todd, who had read his conservatory drawings from memory 4 years ago and written corrections to his wife in Edinburgh and been handed a dead woman's ring and a dead woman's name and sent to a stranger's house in January. How did you identify the lode variance? He said. From a drawing you saw once, 4 years ago. She blinked. Of all the questions she had apparently been prepared for, this was not one of them. I don't know. She said. I look at a structural drawing and I see where the weight wants to go. A pause. It's always been like that. Henry picked up the journal and closed it. I'll have Mrs. Aldrich prepare supper, he said. And then I think we need to have a longer conversation about your uncle, and the ring. And what exactly is in the correspondence between your family's solicitor and mine? He paused at the door. I want you to stay, Miss Todd. Not for 3 days. Long enough to answer all of it. She looked at him for a moment with those clear gray eyes. You're not angry? She said. It sounded less like an observation than a question. That I am several things, he said. Angry is one of them. It's not the most urgent one. He looked at her steadily. The most urgent one is that there are 2 pencil marks in my conservatory drawings that I've been misattributing for years. And I'd like to understand them properly. He paused. Everything else will have to be worked out alongside that. He left at I and the corridor outside. He stopped for a moment. His hand against the cool stone wall. I told H he should meet her properly someday. He said he would. He was 3 years late. She came down to breakfast the next morning with ink on her left hand. Henry noticed it when she reached for the coffee pot. A smudge along the side of her 4th finger. Dark blue-black, the kind that came from writing quickly and not waiting for the ink to dry. He didn't mention it. He filed it alongside the other things he had noticed about Jane Todd in the past 36 hours, that she read with her head tilted slightly to the left. That she moved through rooms with the careful spatial awareness of someone accustomed to navigating spaces that weren't designed for her, that she asked questions in sequence rather than at random. As though she were working through a structure she had already mapped in her mind. He had not slept particularly well. He had sat in the library until past midnight with the journal and a second volume he had not opened since the month after the funeral. Reading backward through his wife's correspondence records, finding 3 letters from Isabel Carrington from Jane Todd, he corrected himself, dated across a period of 14 months. They were not long letters. They were practical, comments on drawings his wife had described in her own letters. Questions about load tolerances. A brief note about a journal article on thermal expansion in iron frame construction that Jane had apparently found in Edinburgh and thought Eleanor would find useful, his wife had written back. He had not read those letters. They were somewhere in the correspondence boxes in the East Wing, and he had not been into the East Wing in 2 years. He thought about this while he drank his coffee and watched Jane Todd add sugar to hers with the expression of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. I'd like to show you something this morning, he said. If you're willing. She looked up. The drawings again? Not the drawings. He paused. The library has a section on structural engineering. Mostly older texts, me father's and my grandfather's. But there's one volume I acquired about 12 years ago that I'd like your opinion on. It concerns load distribution in glass and iron construction. He watched her face. The author's arguments about thermal variance are controversial. I've never fully agreed with them. She set down her coffee cup. He had her complete attention. I'd like to read it. She said that I thought you might. They spent the morning in the library. He pulled the volume Renton's Principles of Iron Frame Construction, 3rd edition. 1803 from the shelf and watched her open it with the same focused care she brought to his architectural drawings. He sat across the table with a different text, ostensibly reading. Actually watching her read, she made no marks. She had no pencil in her hand. But twice he caught her lips moving fractionally, the way they might when someone was working through an argument internally, and once she paused on a page for a full 4 minutes before turning it. Her brow slightly furrowed, and he was almost certain she was running a calculation. He's wrong about the coefficient, she said at last, without looking up. Which section? Page 142. The thermal expansion coefficient for wrought iron in sustained cold. She turned back a page to check something. Then forward again. He's used the summer measurement as his baseline. It produces a significant underestimate of expansion variance in winter conditions. She looked up. Is that what you disagreed with? That's precisely what I disagreed with. Henry said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the slight recalibration of someone revising an estimate. You've been testing me again, she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. Delivered with the same precise tone she brought to structural assessments. Not exactly, he said. He closed his own book. The last 2 days have been partly that. Yes. But not entirely. He paused. I wanted to understand the quality of what you know. Whether it's genuine. He met her gaze. It is. She was quiet for a moment. That doesn't resolve anything, she said carefully. About the ring. About my uncle. About what I'm doing here. No. He agreed. It doesn't. He stood. Replacing Renton on the shelf. But it tells me what I'm actually dealing with. Which is not what your uncle told me I would be dealing with. He turned back to her. I've written to my solicitor in York. He'll be here Thursday. I want the correspondence between your uncle's solicitor and mine examined PR. Oprahly, she looked at the table. Then at him. And until Thursday, he considered. Until Thursday, I'd like to continue what we've been doing. He paused. If you're willing, she picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down again. Something in her expression had changed, not softened. Exactly, but the particular braced quality had lessened slightly, like a door that had been held firmly shut and had now been moved to simply closed. All right. She said that he arrived on Wednesday. Henry heard the carriage on the drive before Mrs. Aldrich came to find him in the drafting room. Heard it because he had been half expecting it for 2 days, in the way that one anticipates a specific kind of trouble. And because the sound of wheels on gravel in January, on an estate road that nobody used without announcement, had a particular quality of wrongness that he came out of the drafting room. Jane was already in the upper corridor, standing at the window that overlooked the drive. Her hands at her sides. He could see, from the set of her shoulders, that she had recognized the carriage. My uncle, she said. Without turning around, yes, she turned then. Her face was composed in the way he had come to recognize as effort rather than ease, the deliberate assembly of a neutral expression over something more complicated underneath. Hell want to speak with you. She said. Hell want to know that the arrangement is progressing as planned. A pause. He want to know that you know my name. Henry looked at her steadily. I'm aware of that. Hell have a version of events prepared. He's very practiced at versions of events. She met his gaze. I want you to know that I didn't know he'd come. I didn't write to him that I know you didn't. Something crossed her face, brief and quickly suppressed, the micro-expression of someone who had not expected to be believed and was recalibrating accordingly. The carriage stopped on the drive below. A man descended, tall. In his late 50s, with the particular bearing of someone who moved through the world on the assumption that it would accommodate him. Come down with me, Henry said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she moved to his left and slightly behind. The instinctive positioning of someone who has learned to take shelter in available margins. That he noted this and said nothing. They went down together. Robert Alderton, uncle, her father's brother, who handled the remaining affairs of the Todd family with the authority of a man who considered other people's circumstances his natural domain, came into the entrance hall with the particular combination of warmth and pressure that Henry had encountered before in men who conducted negotiations by Mac. Everyone else feels slightly off balance. Northminster. He used the wrong title, not publicly wrong, but the informal variant rather than the form Henry would have used in a first meeting. A small deliberate intimacy. He extended his hand. I've been concerned about my niece since the road conditions delayed her arrival. I wanted to come and see for myself that everything had gone smoothly. Henry shook the offered hand. Mr. Alderton. The roads have been difficult this week. He kept high. S voice entirely pleasant. Miss, he paused. A single deliberate beat. Your niece arrived safely and has been well accommodated. Alderton's eyes moved briefly to Jane. Then back to Henry. The glance was short and carried a quantity of information that Henry suspected was intended to be invisibly a quick inventory, an assessment. A fractional pressure that said, you know what you're supposed to do, Isabel. Alderton's voice shifted slightly when he spoke to her, still warm, but with an undertone that was not quite warmth. I'm glad you're well. I hope you haven't been any trouble to His Grace. None at all, Henry said. Before she could answer, Alderton looked at him. Henry met his eyes with complete pleasantness. She has been an exceptionally useful guest, Henry continued. As it happens, I've been engaged in reviewing some architectural plans this week. And Monsieur Niece has provided some valuable observations on the structural calculations. She has a considerable aptitude for it. He paused. I wasn't aware the Alderton family had produced structural engineers. A brief silence. He watched Alderton process the sentence. The mention of structural calculations, the deliberate vagueness about her name, the specific word produced. Isabel has always had a gift for practical matters, Alderton said. With the ease of a man who was recalibrating without appearing to. We've been very proud of her. He smiled at Jane. I'm sure she's been everything you hoped, Your Grace. Henry let the silence run for precisely 3 seconds longer than comfort allowed. She has exceeded my expectations considerably, he said. In several respects. He turned toward the drawing room. Will you take tea, Mr. Alderton? I'd like to discuss some aspects of the correspondence between your solicitor and mine. I've asked my own solicitor to come Thursday. But there are some preliminary questions I'd like to resolve before then. He heard the very slight change in Alderton's breathing, not quite a pause, but a fractional hesitation. The sound of a man who had come expecting one kind of meeting and was realizing he had arrived at a different one. Of course, Alderton said smoothly. I'm always happy to resolve any confusion. They moved into the drawing room. Henry held the door and Alderton passed through it, already beginning the work of repositioning his narrative. Henry glanced back at Jane. She had stopped at the threshold, one hand at her side, her face very still. He held the door and waited. She looked at him for a moment, a quick, precise look. The same assessing quality she brought to structural drawings. As though she were reading him for load-bearing capacity. Then she walked through the door. Henry followed. Mrs. Aldridge brought tea. Alderton took his cup with the settled ease of a man making himself comfortable in someone else's house, which Henry recognized as a negotiating posture. He sat across from his uncle with her hands folded in her lap and her face wearing the assembled neutral expression that Henry was beginning to understand was the face she had learned to wear in rooms that Alderton controlled. Now then, Alderton said, with the air of a man opening a meeting he was confident of concluding favorably. I understand there may be some questions about the documentation. Perfectly natural. Of course. These arrangements can be complex. He set down his teacup. The essential point is simply that the prior correspondence established an understanding between our families. And that Isabel is here to honor that understanding. He smiled. Everything else is a matter of detail. The prior correspondence, Henry said, established an understanding with a specific individual who is no longer living. He kept his voice conversational, his manner entirely calm. The particular stillness of a man who knows where the weight will go and is waiting for it to arrive. That individual was Eleanor Carrington. Not Miss Todd. A silence. Alderton's expression did not change, but something behind it died, a very slight recalibration. Like a drawing that has been measured and found to be 1 degree off vertical. Isabel is family, Alderton said. In these matters, family. Miss Todd, Henry said. He turned to look at her and she was looking back at him. With the expression of someone standing in a structure they had calculated and were waiting to see hold its load. Her name is Jane Todd. She has told me so herself. She has also told me that you gave her my late wife's ring and instructed her to wear it as documentation of an arrangement it was not designed to document. He paused. I find I have a number of questions about how you came to have that ring. The room was very quiet. Alderton looked at Jane. It was not a long look, but it contained, in compressed form, an entire infrastructure of expectation and warning. You know what you were supposed to do, you know what this costs if you deviate. Jane looked back at him. She did not look away. Henry watched her not look away. The ring, Alderton said, recovering smoothly, was provided to me by Eleanor's mother as part of the documentation relevant to this visit. She felt it was appropriate, given. Eleanor's mother, Henry said, does not have the authority to provide items from my late wife's personal jewelry. That jewelry was not part of the estate settlement. It did not pass to Eleanor's family. He set down his own teacup with a precision that was not quite force but was not quite gentleness either. I would like to know how it came to leave this house. Another silence. Longer this time, and in that silence Henry heard what he had been listening for, the specific absence of sound that meant Alderton had reached the edge of his prepared narrative and had not yet found the next position. These things, Alderton said at last, can generally be resolved with some goodwill on all sides. They can, Henry agreed pleasantly. My solicitor will be here Thursday. I look forward to resolving them then. That he lifted his teacup and drank from it, across the room. Jane Todd was looking at the carpet. But her hands, he noticed, were no longer gripped together in her lap. They were resting open, quiet, on the dark wool of her skirt. Alderton stayed the night. Henry had not invited him to, precisely, but neither had he provided a sufficiently direct obstacle. And by the time tea had concluded and the January light had gone entirely from the windows, the implicit logistical difficulty of a return journey to York in the dark had been allowed to resolve itself in the obvious direction. Mrs. Aldrich prepared a second guest room with the expression of a woman who had opinions she was professionally prohibited from expressing. Henry sat through dinner with the particular patience of someone who has decided the current situation is temporary and is conserving his attention for when it matters. Alderton was a practiced conversationalist, moved between topics with the ease of a man who understood that pleasant surface friction was its own form of control, and he directed most of his conversation at Henry. In the way of someone who had already decided that the other person at the table was a fixed variable that didn't require engagement, Jane ate her dinner. She answered when spoken to. She did not look at Henry more than 2 or 3 times across the length of the meal. And when she did it was brief and contained, the quick assessing look he had come to recognize that he looked back each time. He could not have said precisely what he was communicating, but she seemed to receive it. Because each time her shoulders settled fractionally. After dinner Alderton accepted brandy and began a lengthy account of some matter relating to the York Assembly Rooms that Henry listened to with the outward appearance of interest. Jane excused herself quietly at the first available pause. Henry. Why watched her leave? Alderton watched him watch her leave. She's a good girl, Alderton said, when the door had closed. His tone had shifted slightly, less performed warmth. More the register of a man speaking candidly to another man. Sensible. Not given to dramatics. He swirled his brandy. Not Eleanor, of course. Eleanor had a particular, he paused, selecting his word. A particular shine to her. You would have liked her very much, that I am sure. Henry said. Jane is capable, Alderton continued, with the particular inflection of someone using capable to mean adequate. Shall make no difficulties. Henry looked at the fire. She identified a structural error in my conservatory plans, he said. That I've been looking at for 4 years without resolving. That a brief pause. Yes, Alderton said. She's always been another word selection. Clever. About those sorts of things. Henry finished his brandy and set down the glass. I'll say good night. Mr. Alderton. My solicitor arrives at 10 Thursday morning. I'd like you to be present for that meeting. That he left Alderton with the brandy and the fire and went to find Jane. She was in the corridor outside her room, standing at the window that looked over the kitchen garden. She had a candle. She was not looking at the garden. The night was too dark and too overcast for anything to be visible through the glass but at her own reflection, or at some middle distance between the glass and whatever was beyond it. She heard him coming and turned. That I apologize for this evening, he said. I should have found a way to send him on to York. You couldn't have, she said. Not without making it into something larger than it needed to be tonight. A pause. He does that. He makes things the size that's most useful to him. Henry stopped a few feet from her. The corridor was narrow and the candlelight reached just far enough to show him the particular tiredness in her face, not the exhaustion of the first night, which had been physical, but something more fundamental, the tiredness of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for a very long time. That I want to ask you something, he said. And I'd like an honest answer. Though I recognize that's been a complicated request since you arrived. She looked at him steadily. Go on. Your uncle said Eleanor had a particular shine. That you were capable. He paused. I want to know whether this arrangement being sent here, in this way, with the ring, with someone else's name, whether it was proposed to you as a choice. She was quiet for a long moment. Then why father died 2 years ago, she said. He left some debts. Not catastrophic debts. But enough that the house had to be sold, and enough that my uncle became the relevant person for questions about my situation. She looked at the dark window. He told me in December that there was an arrangement that needed to be honored, and that I was the suitable person to honor it. And that the alternative was a position as a governess in Edinburgh that he had identified for me, which he described as quite comfortable. The slight compression of her voice on the final words was the only inflection she permitted herself. He didn't present it as a choice. No. He presented it as a decision he had made on my behalf. She paused. I could have refused. I was aware of that. But refusing would have required more clarity about what I was refusing toward than I had at the time. Henry said nothing. That I know how it sounds. She said that it sounds, he said carefully, like a situation arranged entirely for someone else's benefit. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but that fractional recalibration again, the revision of an estimate. Yes. She said. That's what it was. Henry looked at the dark window for a moment. Then at her. My solicitor is Thomas Merritt. He said. He's been handling the Ashton estate affairs for 12 years. He's thorough, and he doesn't manage other people's situations to suit himself. He paused. When he comes Thursday, I'm going to ask him to look at the question of the ring and the question of the correspondence. I'm also going to ask him whether there's a legal basis for my making a different kind of arrangement. He met her gaze. I don't know yet what that would look like. But I'd like it to be one that doesn't require you to be someone else. The candle flame moved in a draft from somewhere. She looked at him for a long moment with her clear gray eyes. You don't owe me anything, she said. It was not quite a refusal. It was more like a statement of arithmetic, precise, unadorned. Offered because she thought he might have miscalculated. That I know that, he said. I'm not proposing this because I owe you something. He paused. My wife wrote that I should meet you properly. I'm 3 years late. I'd like to stop being late. She was very still. Then, quietly, what does that mean? Practically that it means, he said, that I'd like you to stay. Not as your uncle's substitute for Eleanor. As yourself. He paused. And I'd like to know who that is. I've had 3 days and I've mostly been testing structural calculations. Something moved across her face, brief and unguarded. The expression of someone who had been braced for a very long time against a particular kind of impact and had just discovered it wasn't coming. Not quite a smile. But related to one. That I owe you a full account. She said. Of what my uncle told me. What I was told to say. Which parts of what I've said since I arrived have been his instructions and which parts have been mine. She paused. I'd like to give you that. If you want it. That I want it, he said. She nodded once. The small decisive nod of someone concluding a calculation. Tomorrow morning then, tomorrow morning, he agreed. That he took the candle from her. It was guttering in the draught and she had been holding it slightly awkwardly, sheltering it with her other hand, and lit the wall sconce at her door with it. So that she would have light enough to manage the lock without difficulty. She watched him do this. Good night, Miss Todd, he said. Good night, she said. And then, after a fractional pause, Henry. He looked at her, she looked back at him with the precise, undefended expression of someone who has made a calculation and decided to stand in it. He didn't say anything. He handed her the candle and went back down the corridor, and did not examine, until he was back in the drafting room with the door closed. The specific quality of warmth that had taken up residence somewhere in his chest at the sound of his own name and her voice. Alderton left after breakfast Thursday morning, on the understanding that Merritt's arrival would supersede any further informal conversation. He left with the particular manner of a man retreating to a more favorable position. And Henry watched the carriage out of sight from the entrance hall with the specific satisfaction of a structural problem correctly resolved. Merritt arrived at 10. That he was a small Precise man with the professional temperament of someone who had spent 40 years reducing complicated human situations to their legally relevant components, and who found this reductive process genuinely satisfying. He shook Henry's hand, accepted coffee, and opened his case on the library table with the efficiency of someone who had already read all the relevant correspondence on the journey from York. Jane sat across from them at the library table. She had asked that morning during their 2-hour conversation, during which she had given him the complete account she had promised, in the same careful, sequenced way she asked questions. Beginning with December and working forward to the morning she had walked 4 miles in the mud and fallen asleep in his drafting room whether she might be present for the solicitors' meeting that he had said yes without hesitation. Alderton had not been given the option to attend, the prior correspondence. Denke, Merritt said, spreading the relevant letters across the table, establishes an understanding between the Ashton estate and the Carrington family. However, he adjusted his spectacles. The named party in the correspondence is specifically Miss Eleanor Carrington, deceased October of last year. The correspondence does not name the Carrington family in general or any other individual. He looked up. An arrangement with Miss Eleanor Carrington cannot be legally transferred to another party without the explicit consent of the estate, which was not sought. No. Henry said. It was not, furthermore. Merritt turned to a second letter. The item described as documentation. The ring does not appear in any correspondence I've reviewed. It was not listed in the estate inventory provided to the Carrington solicitor. He looked at Henry over his spectacles. Do you wish me to pursue the question of how it came to leave the estate? Yes, Henry said. Quietly, but thoroughly. Merritt made a note. Then he looked at Jane the first time he had looked at her directly since sitting down. Miss Todd, he said, with the slightly formal courtesy of a man who has been briefed. You were brought here under a misrepresentation that you did not originate and from which you did not substantially benefit. That's my reading of the situation. His Grace agrees. He paused. There are some options available. Depending on what outcome you would prefer. Jane looked at the letters spread across the table, her uncle's handwriting on 2 of them, the formal legal language of the Carrington solicitor on a 3rd. Her face was very composed. What are the options? She said. Merritt began to explain them. Henry sat back in his chair and watched Jane Todd listen to a solicitor describe the legally available shapes of her future, and thought about the entry in his wife's journal. I told H he should meet her properly, and thought about the conservatory plans in the drafting room, and about the pencil mark he had been misreading for 4 years, and about the weight of a thing, and where it wanted to go. Outside the library windows, the January frost had begun, for the first time that week, to recede. She left on Friday, not permanently. Merritt had outlined 3 possible arrangements, and the one she had chosen required a return to York to retrieve certain documents from her uncle's house that established her father's original estate settlement and, more relevantly, the question of whether any of the Ashton jewelry had passed through the Carrington family's hands before Eleanor's death. She needed 2 weeks. Perhaps 3. Merritt had written a letter she could present to her uncle that framed the visit in terms sufficiently legal to prevent him from simply refusing her access. Henry had seen her to the carriage himself. She had the rolled conservatory plan under her arm of the secondary elevation. Not the master drawing. She had asked, the evening before, whether she might take it. He had said yes, and then asked why, and she had said she wanted to think about the eastern corner roof configuration while she was away, because she thought there was a solution to the thermal variance problem that didn't require the simplified glazing bar pattern. He had looked at her for a moment. My wife's design. He said, yes. She had met his gaze without flinching. I think there's a way to keep it and still correct the variance. I'd like to try to work it out. A pause. If that's all right. He had said it was all right. At the carriage she had shaken his hand with the precise professional courtesy of someone concluding a working meeting, and he had shaken hers, and neither of them had said anything particularly significant, and then she had gotten into the carriage and it had moved down the drive. And Henry had stood on the front steps until it had gone around the bend and out of sight. He had then gone back to the drafting room and looked at the empty corner of the table where the secondary elevation had been sitting for 3 years. And stayed there for rather longer than the situation strictly required. the letters began arriving 10 days later. The first was short. It reported that she had retrieved the relevant documents. That Merritt's letter had been sufficient to prevent active obstruction from her uncle, though not to prevent a significant quantity of cold silence. And that she had found something in her father's correspondence that she thought Merritt should see, a letter from Eleanor's mother written 6 weeks before Eleanor's death that made reference to a key she had been given for safekeeping. She would send the original to Merritt directly. At the bottom of the letter, below the signature, there was a small pencil sketch. It was quick and clearly done from memory, the eastern corner of the conservatory roof as it currently existed in the master drawings, with a series of notations along the glazing bar configuration indicating a proposed modification. The modification preserved the geometric pattern his wife had designed while redistributing the load points across 3 additional bars rather than 2. Henry looked at this sketch for a long time. Then he got out his drawing instruments and transferred it to the working copy of the master plan. It was correct. It was, in fact, more elegant than his own solution, which had required simplifying the pattern. He sat with this for a while and then wrote back. His letter reported that Merritt had received her package and was pursuing the question of the key. That the eastern corner modification she had sketched was structurally sound and had been incorporated into the working drawings, and that he had a question about the load calculation she had used for the 3rd glazing bar from the left. Because the figure shed indicated in her notation was slightly different from his own table and he wanted to understand which approach she had used, that he also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the frost had continued to recede and that he had asked the groundskeeper to clear the conservatory site of the remaining debris from the abandoned first construction phase. He did not say why. He was not entirely sure why. Except that the site had been covered in dead vegetation for 2 years and it had begun to seem unnecessary. Her second letter arrived 5 days after the first. It answered his question about the load calculation. She had used a modified version of the table in Renton's 3rd edition with the correct TED coefficient for winter conditions, the errors she had identified during their morning in the library, and it raised 2 further questions about the roof drainage design that he had not considered. At the bottom of this letter there was no sketch. There was instead a single line. I don't know how long is reasonable to stay away. I don't want to be unreasonable about it. Henry read this line several times, then he wrote back a letter that answered both drainage questions, included a revised drainage elevation drawing, and ended with, "There is no defined reasonable. The eastern corner is waiting. Come back when you're ready." He hesitated for a moment before sealing it, then he added, below that line, in smaller handwriting, "I found that the drafting room is considerably quieter than I had previously noticed it to be." He sealed the letter before he could reconsider. Her 3rd letter arrived 8 days later. It was longer than the first 2. And the handwriting was slightly less compressed, the handwriting of someone writing with somewhat less guard than usual, he thought, or perhaps simply less urgency. She wrote about the documents she had found. About a conversation she had had with Eleanor's mother that had clarified several things about how the ring had left the estate. It had been taken by Alderton himself, she believed, during a condolence visit to Ashton Park 3 months after Henry's wife had died, when the house had been largely unoccupied and Henry himself had been in London. Eleanor's mother had not known. She had simply been told, when the ring appeared, that it had been arranged. She also wrote about the drafting table in her father's old study, which she had been using while she was in York, and about the quality of light it got in the afternoons, and about a structural problem she had encountered in a description of a building in one of the engineering journals she had borrowed from her cousin's husband's library, which was a cantilevered gallery design with what seemed to her to be a fundamental miscalculation in the support bracket spacing. At the bottom she wrote, "The drafting room was never quiet. You simply didn't notice what was in it." Henry read this sentence 3 times, then he wrote back the longest letter he had written to anyone in 3 years. He answered the question about Alderton and the key. Merritt had confirmed her account through independent documentation. He answered the question about the cantilevered gallery, because she was right about the bracket spacing and the engineer who had designed it had been wrong, and he knew this because he had consulted on a similar design in 1809 and had the relevant calculations. He also wrote at some length about the conservatory site, which the groundskeeper had now fully cleared, and about what it looked like in the early morning when the light came in at the angle his wife had called precisely right, and about the fact that he had begun to think, in the past 2 weeks, that he might actually build it. That he sealed this letter and gave it to the post rider and went back to the drafting room and looked at the cleared foundation through the window for a long time. That it was the first time in 3 years that looking at it had felt like looking forward rather than backward. Road he wasn't sure, exactly, when that had changed. He thought he knew when she came back on a Tuesday in early March. 3 weeks after she had left, Henry was at the conservatory site when the carriage arrived. He heard it on the drive and stayed where he was examining the eastern corner foundation, which the groundskeeper's clearing had revealed to be in better condition than had expected, and waited. He heard her footsteps on the frost-hardened ground before he heard her voice. She came through the garden gate and stopped a few feet behind him. And for a moment neither of them spoke. "The foundation's intact," he said. "That I can see that from here," she said. "The drainage channel on the south side is slightly blocked. You'll want to clear it before you lay the new courses." He turned around. She was wearing a different traveling dress, a practical grey wool, better suited to Yorkshire in March than the blue one she had arrived in, and she had a leather satchel over one shoulder, and her hair was coming loose from its pins in the wind off the moors. There was ink on her left hand again. She was looking at the foundation with the focused attention of Samuel. "Any reading a structural drawing?" Then she looked at him. "Merritt's letter arrived yesterday," she said. "He's resolved the question of the ring. Your unclean law has confirmed that Alderton took it without authorization. Alderton has agreed, in writing, to a formal withdrawal of all claims arising from the prior correspondence." She paused. "Merritt says the documentation is sufficient." "Yes," Henry said. "He wrote to me as well." She held his gaze. "Then it's over. The arrangement. The correspondence. All of it, the arrangement your uncle made." Henry said, "Yes." A pause. The wind moved across the cleared foundation, carrying the particular smell of cold earth and stone that he had not noticed, or not allowed himself to notice, for 3 years. "I brought the revised drawings," she said. She unslung the satchel from her shoulder and began to open it. "The eastern corner solution, fully worked out. And the drainage revision you sent. With some modifications to the outlet positioning. I think I found a better approach." Henry looked at her hands moving over the satchel, the ink-stained left hand, the precise efficient movements he had been watching for 3 weeks in memory and was watching again. "In fact, Jane," he said. She looked up. He took the satchel from her hands, carefully, and set it on the foundation stone beside him. He did not let go of her hands when he set it down. She went very still. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "for the past 3 weeks. I want to say it directly, because I find that indirection tends to produce errors in the calculations." She looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and he could see her listening. The same total attention she brought to structural drawings, brought to bear now on him. "That I want to build the conservatory," he said. "I've wanted to build it for 3 years and I've been—" He stopped. Amended. "I've been using the not building of it as a way of not finishing something I was afraid to finish. I understand that now." He paused. "I also want to build it correctly. With the eastern corner modification. With the drainage revision. With someone who sees where the weight wants to go." A beat of silence. "That's a description of a professional arrangement," Jane said carefully. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "It's also a description of what I want the rest of my life to look like," Henry said. "Which I recognize is a more significant statement. I'm making it anyway. Because my wife wrote in her journal that I should meet you properly. And I've decided that meeting you properly means being honest about what I've understood since approximately the 3rd day you were here." He looked at her steadily. "I am not proposing this because of the ring or the correspondence or the arrangement your uncle made. I'm proposing it because for the past 3 weeks the drafting room has been considerably quieter than I previously noticed, and because you understood the load calculation in the eastern corner before I did, and because your name is Jane Todd and I would like, if you're willing, to know a great deal more about her." Jane looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the moors. The conservatory foundation waited in the cold March light, its drainage channel slightly blocked on the south side, its eastern corner intact and ready for new courses of stone, that is. She said at last, the most architectural declaration I've ever heard. That I did warn you that I was inclined toward precision. Something happened to her expression, the particular loosening of something that had been held carefully for a long time. Not all at once. But enough. You said come back when I was ready, she said. Yes, that I came back, that I noticed. She looked at the foundation. Then at him. Then at their joined hands, which neither of them had moved to separate. That I would need to keep working, she said. Not as a knot decoratively. Actually. The drawings. The calculations. If there are other projects, I want to be part of them properly. That I have 17 unfinished projects in the drafting room. Henry said. You've already improved 3 of them without being asked. That she stopped. That's not a normal thing to say when you're proposing to someone. That I am given to understand, Henry said, that I'm not entirely normal in my approach to most things. He paused. Is that an impediment? She looked at him for a moment with the expression he had come to understand meant she was making a calculation and had arrived at an answer she was deciding whether to trust. She trusted it at an O. She said. It isn't. They called Merritt back the following week. That he arrived with the same small precise efficiency, set his case on the library table. And looked at the 2 of them across the table with the expression of a man who had drawn a number of conclusions on the carriage ride from York and was professionally committed to not mentioning them. There are several documents to review, he said. Before we proceed, he looked at Henry. You're certain about the terms? I am, Henry said. Merritt looked at Jane. Miss Todd. You've reviewed the draft I sent? That I have. She said. I have a question about section 4. Merritt allowed himself a very small expression that was not quite a smile. Of course you do, he said. And opened his case. The question about section 4 was substantive and required 40 minutes of discussion and 2 revisions to the language before Jane was satisfied. Henry sat through this with his chin in his hand and watched her work through Merritt's legal language with the same structured attention she brought to engineering calculations, identifying the load-bearing points, testing the joints, marking what needed to be strengthened. When it was finished, Merritt gathered the papers and stood. He'll have the final documents ready by the end of the month, he said. In the meantime he paused at the door, allowing himself, this time, the not quite smile in full. I'll note for the record that the prior correspondence has been fully invalidated and all claims arising from it formally withdrawn. He looked at Jane. Your name is in the documents as Jane Todd. As you requested, thank you, she said. Merritt went. Henry looked across the library table at Jane Todd, who was gathering the draft documents into a tidy stack with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands knew what to do with paper, and who had, 3 minutes ago, ensured that the legal record of her existence in this house began with her own name. Section 4, he said. She looked up. The language originally said in accordance with the prior arrangement. She said. I asked him to change it to by mutual agreement of the parties. She paused. It's a small difference. But I wanted it to say what it actually is. Henry looked at her. Yes, he said. That's what it actually is. They broke ground on the conservatory in April. Henry had hired a crew from York, 4 men who had worked with him before and who were accustomed to his particular requirements regarding precision and did not seem to find it unreasonable that a second set of drawings was sometimes presented for their consideration by a woman in a grey wool dress who had strong opinions about drainage outlet positioning. Jane was on site every morning. Henry was on site every morning. This arrangement seemed, to both of them, entirely natural. And they did not discuss it as an arrangement so much as simply find themselves there, in the early light that came in at the angle his wife had called precisely right. With drawings and instruments and an ongoing argument about the correct thermal expansion coefficient for wrought iron in sustained cold, which Jane held to be the modified Renton figure and Henry held to be a value he had calculated independently in 1809 and which was, she maintained, close but not quite right. The argument was never fully resolved. This did not seem to impede the construction. The eastern corner went up in the second week, new stone courses on the intact foundation, the iron framework following in the third week, the uprights set to Jane's corrected angles. Verified twice by Henry and once by Jane herself with a plumb line she had borrowed from the lead carpenter and returned with a notation penciled on the wooden handle indicating the correct tension for Yorkshire conditions. The lead carpenter accepted this without comment. Henry noticed him using the corrected tension from that point forward. The glazing went in on a Thursday in late May. When the light was long and warm and the moors beyond the garden wall had turned from brown to green with a suddenness that always surprised Henry despite occurring every year. He was on the scaffolding when the last panel was set, checking the seal along the eastern corner joint. Below him, Jane was looking at the play of light through the new glass, her head tilted at the particular angle that meant she was calculating something. He came down from the scaffolding. She was standing in the middle of the conservatory floor. And the morning light was coming through the glass and making the geometric pattern his wife had designed preserved in the modified glazing bars, the modification Jane had found, the solution that kept what mattered, and it was falling across the old stone floor in interlocking shapes. Shifting slowly as the sun moved, Henry stood beside her and looked at the light. "It works," he said. "Of course it works," she said. "The geometry was always right. It only needed the load to be properly distributed." He looked at her. She was watching the light move across the floor with the clear attention that was entirely and specifically hers. And the morning came through the glass above them at the angle that was precisely right, and the conservatory that had been unfinished for 4 years was finished. And the weight of it had gone exactly where it had always wanted to go. He reached into his coat pocket, the ring which Merritt had returned to him after the legal proceedings were concluded, in a small envelope with a note that said simply "for your consideration" was still there. Where it had been for 6 weeks, which he recognized as somewhat longer than strictly necessary for consideration, Jane was still watching the light. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. He held out the ring. She looked at it for a long moment. The narrow gold band, the oval emerald, the engraving she had been wearing on the night she arrived, exhausted and frightened and more honest than the situation had required her to be. "That's your wife's ring," she said. "It was," he said. "It's also." He stopped. Found the right words with the same care he brought to load calculations. "It's also the ring that was on your hand when I found you. And it's the ring I'd like to give you. If you want it. Not because it belonged to her. Because it was the first thing I saw when I understood that something needed to change." He paused. "I'd like it to mean something new." Jane looked at the ring for a long moment, then she looked at him with the gray eyes that calculated and the hands had found the load-bearing point and the name that was her own and had been her own all along. "Something new," she said. "Yes." She held out her hand. He placed the ring on her finger, the same finger it had rested on the night she arrived. The same hand that had sketched corrections in the margins of his plans, the same hand that was ink-stained now from the morning's work. The light shifted through the geometric pattern overhead. "The drainage channel on the south side needs clearing," she said. "Before it rains, that I know," he said. "I'll see to it this afternoon." "Good." She looked at the ring on her hand with the expression of someone who has completed a calculation and found it correct. "The eastern corner is holding." He looked at the eastern corner, the upright set to her angles. The glazing bars carrying his wife's pattern, the load distributed across the 3 bars she had sketched in the margin of her first letter, the frost line below the foundation exactly where he had calculated it would be. "Yes," he said. "It is, outside." The May light moved over the moors. Inside the conservatory, the geometric shadows shifted slowly across the stone floor, and the ironwork held its load, and the weight rested exactly where it had always wanted to be.